Kia ora and good morning, everyone. Welcome to workshop 3 of our long-term plan 2027 to 2037. A number of topics to cover today around mainly the base assumptions around the long-term plan that will build into where we're going. This is being live streamed and will be publicly available on YouTube. If we do face an emergency, please make your way to the nearest exit and we'll meet down on Devonport Road. So we will get underway and I'll ask Councillor Baker to please give us an opening karakia.
Ai, mauri ora I te whare. Ki mihia te pōranga haua te ao, kia I o rangi, kia I o nuku, kei ngā mata o te ariki. Kei mata nuku, kei mata rangi, ke reira koe tāne te waiora, e ngā maunga rū, e ngā awa para whenua he reu te ki tai ki mau awe, ko koe, ko au, ko tāua nei, whiti ao, whiti ora, ara mai te toki, haumi e hui e, tae ki e.
Right, thank you. So we are in a workshop. There won't be any decisions made today. However, we can certainly give a steer to the staff as to which direction we may want to look at. But a lot of this is information more than anything. So I'll hand over. We've got a range of presenters today, so I might hand over to Christine Jones, and she can lead it from here. Thank you, Christine.
Morena everyone. So you've asked us in workshops just to give you a bit of a recap of where we've come from and where we're going to. So this slide just goes through what's happened to date in terms of the LTP. So you've approved the community outcomes and the principles, and you gave us direction on your priorities. You endorsed the project plan and an early list of issues. In early May, we presented the environmental scan, and you'll recall there was an A3 document that just showed how all the sort of big bits of the jigsaw of the LTP fitted together in the sort of chunks of work that would need to happen. The finance team gave you an overview of the financial position, and we framed up the non-financial KPIs and just talked about those. In early June, there was quite a lot of work that we did around the implications of the capital program, and some more work around the issues list and prioritisation. And at the last council meeting on the 23rd of June, you signed off the issues as a working list of issues to come back to you either through workshops or papers. You gave us direction around your rates limits, so the 2 scenarios that you wanted us to work through in terms of preparing financial information and some of the underpinning principles and directions. So that's now what we're working with in the organisation as we move forward. So that's done. And if we move to the next slide. What are we doing today? So today the topics we're covering are significant forecasting assumptions. So under the legislation we are required to define our significant forecasting assumptions. So we'll just give you some background about what we need to do and why. There are a number of them, but we're really going to focus on the 4 key ones that have sort of quite a significant impact, although they do all impact, but these are the big ones. The next topic, we had committed to talk to you around how we build up the capital program. So this is not about specific projects within the capital program. It's about how does a project of a capital nature get into the LTP, so what's the pathway? How do we develop the costings, and how do we deal with contingency for capital projects that go into the LTP, and how do we provide oversight? What are the stage gates? How do we manage the project? So that's sort of individual project agnostic. It's more about the overall process, and then later on we'll bring you more about individual projects, and you can drill down into individual costings or individual gateways. This is to see whether you're comfortable with our broad approach to how we bring these budgets together. You have asked us to look at zero-based budgeting, so we are presenting to you our broad approach to that in a similar manner. Are you comfortable with that broad approach? And then subsequently you will see those individual zero-based budgets coming through the individual activity area plans as each manager has done the work and presents their particular topic. So again, this is, are you comfortable with the approach? Have we heard what you've said to us? Have we captured the intent of what you're asking us to do? And then we will flow that into the business. And the fourth topic, if we have time, is just working through the non-financial performance measures, the work that's been done and the direction that that's heading in. So that's what the aim is for today. The bulk of the time will be on the capital program. The other ones are quite a lot shorter. So back to the roadmap. So we've presented this now a few times. So we're still in these pinky shade boxes around what are we going to do and how will you pay for it? Because some of the strategic setting in terms of the outcomes and the financial envelopes that are at a high level and the high level priorities you've now given us, and so we're working within those parameters and into this next stage. And this will roll through, as you can see here, pretty much rolls through the next few months, and as we're heading towards late November, early December, you'll start to see this all come together as a combined package of LTP. From now to then, they're going to be individual components or packages of components which you will provide direction with, subject to reviewing it when it comes together as one package. So each time you're not signing it off for a final time, you're just agreeing particular elements that you want incorporated into the LTP. Then you'll step back and look at the whole picture in December and go, are we comfortable with that, or do we want to modify, change priorities? But hopefully a good chunk of it will be embedded from the direction you've given us. So that's how that will flow through. So I'll hand over to Cherie, who'll work through. Oh, sorry, any questions? Yep.
Yeah, sorry, just more of a learning question for me. So that roadmap you provided, is that also what like an LTP amendment process would look like too, or is that quite different?
So LTP amendment process is quite different because you're only dealing with one or two issues that you're changing. Generally, you might be changing a really significant project. So say for Te Manawa Take o Te Papa, if you had it in your LTP and you were going to take it out, but you wouldn't go back and revisit all of your assumptions and everything else, so you'll just pick that particular topic and what would be the implications of that topic or couple of topics. Yep.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to introduce the assumptions this morning. So just got a slide up there now on why we have assumptions. So assumptions are the building blocks of the LTP, essentially. They're also a legislative requirement, so they're required under Schedule 10, Clause 17 of the Local Government Act for those keeping score. They are important for financial estimates, infrastructure planning, and strategic information. More importantly, they provide transparency to the community on what the LTP is based on and where uncertainty sits. Audit also has a focus on the assumptions. So I'll now just hand over to Cherie to walk you through the 4 key assumptions that we've picked out to present on this morning.
Good morning. My part of this workshop is very short and it just focuses on the significant assumptions that have a critical impact on financial outcomes. You would have received the full suite of assumptions ahead of this meeting, and it's my understanding that these will be adopted at the next council meeting. Just to provide some insight into the number of significant assumptions, this slide shows all of those. There's 38 in total, and they've been divided into 11 themes. So for the finance team and the business areas that we support, there's many assumptions that impact on operational budgets, the capital program and debt levels. Today I'm just going to take you through the 4 most critical financial assumptions. And like Christine said, later in this workshop, Renika will go through how the capital budgets are costed, including risk assessments, budget management and governance. So interest rates. This is a visual of some of the sources we use for landing our interest rate assumptions. Just noting that these are all from the 22nd of June, so last week, and they have changed since then, and they change constantly. During a planning process, we generally update our interest rate assumptions following a Reserve Bank monetary policy statement, which generally triggers banks to revise their forecasts, and it also drives market volatility and change. And you'll see these changes coming through to you as we bring drafts of this LTP to council meetings. Just to quickly explain these charts, the first one in the top left is the 4 major banks' 90-day borrowing rate forecasts. This is what we use for our floating rate assumptions in the short term. The table down the bottom, the big long table, that's a swap grid, and that looks out further than the bank forecasts, and it's market driven rather than the bank's economist forecasts. That also is used for longer run floating rate assumptions. The table in the top right with the green banners, that's from LGFA. We get these weekly. That shows each tenor or maturity that we can use for borrowing, and it's got the fixed and floating margins for TCC's credit rating. The bottom right-hand table, it's kind of a summary of that swap grid, but it also includes the 90-day borrowing rate of the day. So on the 22nd of June, that floating rate was 2.71%, but you'll see in that top left chart that the banks are expecting this borrowing rate to increase up to an average of 3.74% by September 2027, and those forecasts roll out as the year progresses. So how do we use these charts to actually set our interest rate assumptions? So for floating debt, we will use that. Do you mind flicking back one? Thank you. For floating debt, we use that top left chart, which is the 90-day borrowing rate. In an example where I would say I'm going to borrow floating for 8 years, so I'm going to use that 2034 maturity on the LGFA chart. So I would, if I was borrowing today, I would use that 2.71% 90-day rate, and then I would add 83 basis points on that because that's the LGFA margin. In the long-term plan, I would be using that 3.74% plus the 83 basis point margin because that's where the banks are forecasting for that floating rate to be during the LTP, during year 1 of the LTP. And I follow that curve in year 1 as well. So at the beginning of the LTP, we wouldn't expect to be at 3.74% straight away. We'll probably follow that curve up. For years 2 to 10, we will use the 10-year spot rate, which I've highlighted in a red box there, the 4.07%, and add that 83 basis point margin on if I was borrowing to 2034. For fixed debt, we use the LGFA fixed rates, which, just using that 2034 tenor as another example, fixed rate, that's 4.82%. Can you flick over now, thanks. So what I just said, I've tried to put my methodology into writing here, and this is what you'll see in your significant assumptions pack that you get along with all of the other assumptions. And these will change over the course of the plan as the market reacts to stuff that's happening overseas and as the Reserve Bank releases monetary policy statements and we start to see that hiking cycle come in and the timing of that.
So that will be locked in as at the date we adopt the long-term plan?
Yes, so when we start bringing drafts to you, I'll lock in some assumptions and I'll bring this table to you.
Yep.
But as we progress through the year of the planning cycle, I'll update these. But on adoption date, we will be locked into an assumption.
Yep. Yeah. Okay, cool.
And it should be noted that interest rate expense budgets flex for several reasons, not just the interest rate assumptions. The capital program and the funding stacks change those interest rate budgets, as well as the timing of drawing down debt and the interest rate assumptions. You can
Sorry, I just interested why we use, the 10-year swap for the whole period. Like, I get it at 10 years, but why don't we use a 2-year swap for the 2 years and a 5-year swap for 5 years? Or
We did have this conversation with Bancorp, our advisors, and they advised us to use that 10-year spot rate because it averages out over years 2 to 10.
yeah,
And I guess from a simplicity perspective, it's a lot simpler to have one rate for years 2 to 10, and they get revised each annual plan.
yeah.
And then that's the highest rate in there as well. So I guess it's more conservative.
Okay, no, I'm just wondering. That's great explanation. Thanks.
And just to illustrate my point about interest rates changing, this chart shows how significantly borrowing rates have changed over the last 10 years. So you'll see those really low rates during and just after COVID, and then the hiking cycle that followed that, and then the easing cycle that we're in now and we're expected to come out of very shortly. So moving to growth, these are the draft growth assumptions for dwellings. They will be updated during the long-term plan as more statistics become available to Ave's team. What I've put on this slide here is how these growth assumptions impact the financial outcomes of the LTP. So there's a list of various outputs that rely on these growth assumptions. For example, rating-based growth, where and when we deliver our infrastructure, how much DC revenue we will receive, and how much we will charge on DCs. The population and dwelling assumptions are also used as volume assumptions for user fees, such as consent revenue, dog registration, parking, and community facility use.
I'm interested, where are those from? Might be an Andy question.
Yeah. There's various sources that they use. Did you want to?
And will they align to, like we've just had this discussion at Smart Growth, so they align there, or?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, originally they're from Smart Growth growth projections produced by Nadir. They've been adjusted over the years. The housing and business capacity assessment sort of informed some adjustments that we made to the 10-year plan figures for the draft, and we're reviewing those at the moment. I understand you've been updated by the University of Waikato through Michael Cameron, who are doing work at the moment just to review the latest Stats New Zealand figures, and they'll produce a revised set at the end of the year through that. That might lead to some adjustments to what we have here once that work's completed.
And how accurate have we been on previous LTPs?
Yeah, we've been fairly accurate actually, but just in recent times we're aware of the downturn in development, so we've just been monitoring that. You get the annual sort of development trends report, so we're monitoring dwelling consent unit numbers against what's projected, and yeah, we sort of make adjustments along the way, and we update our allocations as well based on that.
Any other questions on growth or population? Yeah.
Comment. I remember Christine presenting at Smart Growth and addressing that very issue, and we were amazingly consistent as a council, like beyond all the margins of error I would normally expect.
Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mahe. So I do also recall that projection, but could we just have the table that showed for the last two LTPs what this table looked like in terms of assumption versus what actually happened, please? If that information is all available.
So we can provide that, and this is only the draft work, so when we bring you what we're recommending to adopt, we can provide that context at the same time.
But this will be the same as what Smart Growth say.
it's all aligned. So there's been a principle for many, many years that all of the growth assumptions that the council do align with the long-term growth assumptions of smart growth,
Yeah.
and that we share.
I can't hear if anyone's speaking.
Can you hear that? No?
You need to be a bit louder.
Wow. Okay. Can you turn yours off, Mahe? Maybe that's what's doing. Is that any better? No. Okay. That's right. Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, it's an issue there. So there's been a long agreed principle that the growth projections that the councils use align to the smart growth projections, particularly the long-term projections. We generally might look at the early years and look at what's currently happening on the ground in terms of the market and modify the spread, but certainly the longer-term endpoints are aligned, and that those growth assumptions are applied through all of council's planning work, so that we don't have some stuff done on one and some stuff done on another, and that flows through including to the transport model, which is a shared transport model between Tauranga City Council, Western Bay Planning Council, Regional Council and NZTA, are all based on those same growth assumptions, which we agree.
Thank you, that's great.
Right, capital subsidy revenue. So subsidy revenue and funding stack arrangements have a significant impact on what and when things can be delivered. You would have seen that during Susan's work on capital envelopes, with projects that have grant revenue having a very different impact on the debt outcomes than those that don't have grant revenue. It should also be noted that grants and subsidies help with the balanced budget metric. So this table here is not a final or technical review of grants, but I've just provided it to show you the types of grants that we have, the big picture ones, and the level of confidence around those grants. Inflation. So we use external sources for our inflation assumptions. And there's a few things just to note around inflation assumptions. The type of work is modelled separately, so roads, pipes, buildings. That's because all of their costs move at very different rates. Inflation is built up from real costs, so labour, bitumen, steel, concrete plant and overheads, not just one factor. And we don't use CPI. That's because construction costs behave very differently than household costs. And if we were to use CPI, it would completely misstate what we actually pay to deliver. This slide takes cost inputs and shows how the mix can change depending on the type of asset that you're delivering. So each pie has a different mix. So each asset class rises in cost at its own rate. For example, you can see, hopefully you can see, that vertical builds have a higher material makeup than water, while roading is significantly impacted by bitumen. Right, so just to make everybody comfortable about where we're at right now and the level of certainty around these assumptions, the world can change very fast and no forecast can fully keep up. This chart here shows the unprecedented level of uncertainty right now. And this is based on the number of times the word uncertainty appears in economic reports around the world. So this is why we treat our numbers as careful, regularly updated best estimates, not guarantees, and we refresh these as the world changes.
Do we actually show the infrastructure inflation chart anywhere as a comparison to the standard CPI figure? So people can actually see the costs that we have to factor in for our infrastructure growth?
In the full significant assumptions section of the LTP, we have a inflation our costs and inflation your costs. So that's where you would see the difference between what households face versus what councils face.
Yep, Councillor Shorlott.
Which one's driving the current central government pressures around rates capping? Nothing, or is that must be aligned to?
CPI.
So that's on CPI, and we're just being told ours are different. So
Yep,
that's a significant planning issue.
yep. Councillor Crowther.
How do we incorporate scenario planning into this? You know, in terms of we can kind of, with population, you can see that there'd be a range and we choose a number, but with this, it is volatile, as you say. So do you do what a lot of global businesses do, which is look at scenarios, or do you just fix on, we'll just take the construction cost index is going to be this in the year 2037 and hope for the best?
For an annual plan or an LTP, you have to pick a position. So that's why we rely on external sources to provide that information. And you do, I guess, during an annual plan process, you get another go at that, and you can flex your assumptions each year as those years roll on.
Through the chair, I guess I was meaning, like, to get to that, yes, we have to end up with some numbers, but do we get sort of scenario? Because there'll be, you know, on one side there'll be people who will want to be optimistic, on the other side people will be wanting a precautionary approach, but the cost of getting something wrong could be quite significant, especially with rates caps. So it's like, do you, I mean, there's a past track record where we've kind of underestimated some things, and then there's maybe an overcorrection to put in significant contingencies as a result, but it's all almost trying to second guess things in the wrong way, in my view. So it'd be better to have scenarios and just look at how they diverge, and then we pick a position, I would have thought. But is there scope for that within the LTP?
We're going to talk about contingency in the next session.
Right. Keep moving.
I will just plug in because we've had an extra slide added. Glad that worked. So this part of the presentation is a bit more nuts and bolts on how dollars actually end up in the final plan that you will get to see post-August. So the fundamental three questions we are trying to answer with this part of the presentation is, how does a project end up in the LTP? How do we then determine the costs and the contingencies factor of that? If we have time, we can also go and how do we provide oversight? How do we do governance and management of those so you know that the right thing is managed at the right time? Because the latter is more project management 101, I don't know if we need to talk through that. If time allows, we might just go straight to Q&A because there was a lot of background information supplied in this pack. So let's tackle the first one. How do CapEx items end up in the LTP? The high-level point here is that there is three ways to get in. It's a renewal of assets we already have. It's a project we have already committed to. Now, committed to could be a legal requirement, or it could be we literally have a contract put in place. And then the third one is we want an improvement to our city. So together, the renewal, the committed, and the improvement ones assure that we have minimum requirements met and that we can deliver on the priorities that we set in the LTP. Initial business cases are used for most of these parameters, and they will align on which priorities are met at the for this project to be deserving of including. So let's dive into the committed projects a little bit. We did update the definition of this. We tightened this a little bit, and then we talked about that last time when we talked about the prioritization framework. So these are the 3 key parameters: committed projects, legislatively required, or critical risk. We are not going to talk about the waters program because that's not included in the LTP. Replacement or renewal of existing assets. So this is a like-for-like replacement. Think our most favorite topic of resealing of roads. They are driven by our asset management system, and therefore any changes to those often lead to higher cost, as we try to do renewals at a point in time before significant costs are incurred. If I stick with the roading example, you try to reseal before your substructure is affected. Or you try to change a playground over before someone gets hurt when their equipment breaks. We prioritize that and we align that to our asset management plan. I will skip through to possibly the most interesting bit, the additional projects, the improvements we want to do. Any project that we want to do goes through an initial business case. The initial business case starts with a high level, what is the scope, what is the cost, is this a benefit that we want to chase at that cost? And how does it align with our strategic objectives? What are the things we want to achieve with this LTP, and does this fit with it, in simple terms? Now, you won't have seen a lot of these initial business cases, because as long as I've been here, which admittedly isn't very long, we haven't done those. Previous LTPs have been quite ambitious in their scope, and hence most projects that are in the LTP will have already gone through this step. There are a few waiting in the wings, but they will be a handful, not an overwhelming amount that you will have to consider. So what happens once we have an initial business case and we've decided that, yes, this fits our priority, and yes, this is the right scope for the right benefit? It then goes into the prioritization program. Something that is the right scope for the right benefit and the right outcome may still be a lower priority than something else that is the right scope for the right money. The prioritization framework we talked about last time, so I'll skip that bit. So that was a high-level intro to how do things get into the LTP. And before we go into the cost and contingency part of that, just thought I might pause and see if anybody had any questions on this.
I'll just ask. What's the financial threshold for non-transport projects that need a business case? Because I understand it'll be $5 million for a transport one.
It's $500,000 for any project, and it's not just a transport. I've used a transport example, and that might have confused people. This applies across the board, across anything: libraries, roads, playgrounds.
So just to be clear, we're saying $500,000 for non-transport, but transport will shift to $5 million?
Internally? Oh, sorry, Mike, do you want to answer?
Yeah, sure. So because transport's different, but what we are seeking to do is to use our initial business case process as the starting point for transport projects, so that we align with everything else and they can be prioritised like for like. The requirement for business case for NZTA will only trigger at $5 million. So generally we'll group up lots of little things and head up towards the $5 million, and then do a business case from the agency perspective as a result. But yeah, we are aligning with the internal process.
Through the chair, having read up a bit on this, like my feedback would be that we run the risk of doing substandard business cases because they'll be for such small amounts of money in the scheme of things that if we had like a $600,000 project, and having seen some of the business cases of councils, including this one, I think it's worse to have a wrong business case or a flawed business case in some ways than just to have a non-business case but to have a robust financial analysis. And I think that's what worries me. You have a business case, typically, as I understand them, has a lot of guff, if I can put it in technical terms. And I think what we're needing is just a concise summary, unless it's of such significance that we need to read through page after page after page of all the reasons why Ron's project is so good or whatever, the equivalent of that.
Fair point that these things can be bulky at times. We do size them to suit. So a 600K project will clearly have a different business case, length and content and depth than a $600 million project. So that is part of the last part of the presentation of Project StageGate. We take a project, we size it, and it follows a different project management path, including different requirements for the initial business case. Now, you will have seen the big ones, and hence the impression might be that all of these are hundreds of pages. That's not the case. Secondly, the initial business case is the pathway to get in. From there on, you have multiple points in time where you can go, this no longer meets what we were trying to achieve. The cost has doubled, the benefit has halved, whatever it is, our strategic priorities have changed. And you can, at any stage gate or through any LTP, change that parameter for us, right? The initial business case will never have a solid financial analysis because you don't yet know what you're doing. If I take the, say, the Durham Street connection by the busway, we didn't know whether we were building a goat track or whether we were building a pedestrian bridge over into a building in Grey Street. That makes a massive difference for your financial analysis. What we were trying to do with those initial business cases is roughly what parameters are we going to look within? Roughly, does that meet the benefits? Follow the initial business case. There is then a business case at the second gate. That will have more financial analysis because at that point in time, your scope will have narrowed, your risk appetite will be clear, etc. Does that help? Yep. Any other questions on how you get into the LTP if you were a project? All right, moving swiftly along. It's a dry topic, people. It's so this is probably the bit where we were expecting the most questions. So apologies I've raced through the first bit. I want to allow for proper conversation on this one. So if you think about the cost of a project, there's a lot of things that drive that. We're going to talk about the cost, the scope, the contingency, how we manage a contingency, and Alistair's going to help with the procurement. You already know this, so apologies if this is a bit of sucking eggs, but Project 101, the cost of your project is driven by amenity. So, for instance, a library like Te Manamataki or Te Papa is very different from your local regional community library. The complexity, for instance, we had a council meeting last week about a cultural centre near Cliff Road that clearly had complexities from a stakeholder point of view. The standards you have to live up to. For our projects, we have to live up to our IDC, our development code, but there is a raft of regulations that we have to comply with as well. The higher those standards, the higher the costs will be generally. And then the benefits of those might determine the scope as well. It's different if you're trying to build a sports field for one sport or for a multi-sport facility. At a very high level, how do we control scope? The indicative business case is the first point that clearly delineates this and is the ultimate guidance that needs to be given early on. For instance, if I use the Durham Street example, the initial business case could have said, and we will not consider anything that requires electricity infrastructure. We won't do rollators, what do you call those things? Up and down, anyway, the airport ones. And we don't do a pedestrian bridge. We will only look at concrete, wood sort of solutions, as an example. The project governance, hence, we have gates that control the smaller and lower risk project all the way through the scope. When we have a larger project, we put them through a stage gate committee where scope is checked every time. And if it's a really significant project, you will get to see it. So whether that is significant from a cost, from a complexity, or from a risk perspective, right? As an example, you don't, the actual dollars associated with the recovery might fall in a different category, but it is significant and risky enough that we take all of that back to council.
Just as an addition, I think, particularly on that last slide, innovation is where the early phases benefit from feedback and from your governance. So in those early phases, when you're thinking about your problems you're trying to solve and then defining the scope as a filtered process, that's the time where you can have the most influence on the outcome, what you're trying to deliver, and the cost. And I think one of the key messages, key takeaways for today is those early phases, absolutely critical to controlling cost and controlling outcomes. So, and I think that's the trade-off we're trying to portray here in our projects, is that we see that from a design perspective as the most critical phases.
So this is the...
Councillor Roseboom.
Oh, sorry.
Just one quick question on percentage of costs, so from the whole project cost, how much of that total cost is this first initial phase?
0.1%, if that.
If that.
Sorry, I don't have actual statistical numbers for you, Councillor Rosenbaum. This is 99% of projects that go through an initial business case will have had no real work done to them. It will be desktop work. Once we go through a concept design, you do things like ground investigations if you're building something, or stakeholder engagements if you're doing a community project. So those sorts of things happen later. Initial business case is simply the decision, is this worth thinking about or not? That's the decision that gate takes. Does that help? So this is the summary view of where you have a chance to control scope, and this is done relative to size of the project currently or complexity of the project, as I explained on the previous slide. So that's a two-slide intro to scoping. Going on to the cost estimation process. So we've tried to simplify this by the picture on the right-hand side. First, you start with a construction cost estimate. If you want to build a house, you're going to get a construction cost estimate. But then you know on top of that you have non-construction cost estimates. For council, that is things like our internal time writing. It might be consultation costs. Those non-construction costs are added up to make a base estimate cost. What does this project cost us in totality? Not just to build, but to manage. That base estimate is the view of the world if everything goes smooth. The world's never smooth. We saw that awesome graph and assumptions slide just before. So we have a risk quantification that we put on top of that. There's known risks. For instance, if we build anywhere in low-lying land in Tauranga, we will have a risk of geotechnical issues that drive costs up. There can be stakeholder engagement risks. There may be previous project experience that say, actually, for these type of projects, we need to allow for more X. Those are known risks. When you add those on to the base estimate, you get what we call an expectation estimate or an expected estimate. That is what a project should be able to be delivered for if you manage known risks only. Humans are actually really bad at forecasting and not accounting for things that are outside of the known knowns. That is where you take the expected estimate into a contingency view to come to your total project cost estimate. History has taught us that contingency is not a nice to have. It is actually to manage the things that you don't yet know. Contingency can also be used for things you do know but can't quantify. For instance, in the early stages of a project, you do know that you're going to have to consult. You don't know what that will drive. If we knew exactly what the community was going to tell us, we wouldn't need to consult. Those are the factors in the contingency that then leads to a total project cost estimate. The total project cost estimate is what ends up in the LTP. Now, I'm going to dive a little bit more into that risk and contingency part of it. So if you look at this slide at the bottom, there is the range of stage gates that we will go through. And what I'm trying to link here is to say your risk and contingency will always be higher in the early stages. So I'm going to hone in on that table with the orange heading. At a very early stage, you haven't identified your risk yet, right? At an initial business case, you might have thought of the obvious ones. We're in Tauranga, we have low-lying land. But other than that, the site specificness, the project specific risks will have yet to be identified. So your contingency has to be very high to allow for that to happen. When you go into feasibility studies, you have more data. You might have done your geotech reports. You might have consulted with your a focus group of your community, so a small representative group. So you have more knowledge, but not enough, etc., right until when you have a truly fully developed design, when your contingency can be low because your project and your risks are really well defined. The way we are asking our staff to accommodate for that is through that second table, the one at the top with the blue headings, where in early stages, we just give a percentage. The white boxes there are simply a table that says, if you're in this stage, use this percentage of contingency. That covers in initiate virtually everything because you don't know anything. By design stage, you might have really small projects that just use this as an ease of running a project. But that only counts for the small projects. The triangle that's labeled workshop there is for your very large project or very late stages. At that point in time, you have workshopped what your risks are. You are managing your risks. You know about them. You can account for them. That is a bespoke approach per project then. You can move away from the prescribed percentages and go into a bespoke approach. All of Jane's portfolio falls into that category. I'm going to move to the next slide for the base cost estimating, but this is what I want to say about the risk and cost estimating. The base cost estimating, I really like this table, even though there's a lot of words in it. This effectively says early in your project, when you don't know enough, you need a lot of uncertainty. And you'll see percentages there, 50, 40, 30, 15. They are guidance numbers that give you an idea of how much contingency you need to have to allow for the uncertainty in what you do not know. There is, of course, a time element to this that is linked to those pre-initiate stages. A project, an infrastructure project that is currently a pre-initiate can be in design, give or take 5 to 10 years from now, sometimes longer. The infrastructure strategy covers 30 years because some of these take multiple decades. In the 0 to 3 years, so there's the focus of our LTP, which is correct in a VUCA world, most of these will be in the highly accurate bucket, i.e. your contingency will be lower and your accuracy will be higher. The 7 to 10 years, the projects that are currently not yet known will carry a lot of uncertainty. So, for instance, when we're talking about Tumu, right, they had the very high costs for our waste and water supply, our infrastructure in total. Part of that was a very high level of contingency that we apply, because in the early stages we don't yet know if we're building a 5-lane highway or a GO track, to stick with that terminology. The outer years, just bear in mind that always those outer years will almost inevitably be the earlier project stages, which will mean the cost has yet to be refined. That's the key message from this slide. And because I know everyone loves to talk about contingency, I thought we would summarize this. This is actually a summary that Mike did spectacularly within the space of 2 days. For our project managers, this is a 150-page slide pack that explains exactly which steps to follow to get their contingency released. So we manage contingency closely. To get contingency, there must be a true known unknown. We don't use contingency for scope changes unless there is a new legislative requirement, for instance. There is various steps in here. This process is tightly controlled through both finance and the project management groups. There are improvements we can do to this. There always will be. There is a lot in here in terms of what the hoops our project managers need to jump through that might be simplified. This is also run by project, whereas in reality, not every project will need its contingency. We have talked about program contingency as part of a more holistic approach to contingency management. That is not part of this LTP presentation. I just want to flag it's on the radar, just not here yet. The next part of the presentation is about procurement. Before I hand over to Alistair, does anybody want to ask questions around the scope and cost estimating, contingency and risk management part of that?
I think for me, it's just, yeah, this is a broader conversation, is how we report, how we monitor it, how we, actually deal with contingency. We've talked about contingency pools rather than project by project, and I think that's a wider discussion, but just want to flag that. Still keen to have that discussion going.
Yeah, me
forward.
too. Sorry, that might be a bit too enthusiastic. I think we can be more balanced in our budget if we implement that. However, the contingency, and we do monitor this quite closely, and we have a stage gate process where this goes through. The layer on of program contingency requires a set of guidance to our project managers and to delegation of authorities that we will need to consider over a bit more time than we have in this LTP.
Yeah, but I think it's an ongoing. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Councillor Shulart.
Thank you. Just a question of interest, which I have, comparing us to, so this identify, initiate, planning and design's part of every sector, private sector, us, public, local government. Just for those first 4 stages, what's typically the difference between what we would have to spend as a percentage of a project versus what you'd expect in the private sector that doesn't have to worry about consulting, that doesn't have to worry about a whole bunch of stuff? So if it's 10% in the, what is the difference that we have as a burden because we're a council effectively?
At a high level, a pre-initiate stage, because it's desktop only, there is no different from a commercial body. At initiate and planning, that ramps up. Mike, do you have more detail you want to add?
Yeah, I think in terms of the comparison between private sector and there's 2 dimensions. With infrastructure, the public sector is largely involved in most of it, but there are private sector infrastructure elements. Yeah, private sector can move quickly through. The advantage they have is decision making is very tight and closed, and they're able to make decisions very quickly, which powers up their machine. Whereas the public have to consider a lot more, do a lot more consultation. There's a lot more consideration of a wider set of outcomes. And so that often means that our business cases end up having to be quite a lot longer. So in transport space, it's very much that. But in terms of sort of like-for-like cost, it's probably the same. It's just the time. And I think it's more about the speed of the way that we can get to the decision point with particularly big pieces of infrastructure in a public sector context.
I think the S-curve, if you like, the normal, you spend very little in the beginning and then it ramps up as you construct, and then you have a little bit of commissioning and handover cost. The S-curve would be a little bit higher earlier on. I think we do add cost in a local government setting because of the need to consult, because of the need to be transparent. So, for instance, part of our estimating guidance includes at a certain stage you need to involve an independent QS to verify your cost. Not all private companies would do that. They would trust their cost estimating. And also, we are here for the community, right? So we want to do right by the community. That is not always the driver of a private company. I can tell you from experience that there's a big difference between an oil and gas company putting in a gas pipeline through people's property or our water department putting in a water pipeline through our roads. And that shows up in the costs as well as the timelines. Does that answer your question?
Better than I anticipated, thank you. What was that? But I suppose that, this is the planning stuff, but we're looking at for example, a pool that we wanted to build and that was going to go somewhere, and then for a reason that we chose, we changed that, and then we're looking at another part of it, and then the public's come back in, and, you can see, it's just scary to think what could be in the private sector, simple thing for us could become hey, maybe we'll do a whole lot of stuff and do nothing. Or, so this is one of the things that that's really intrigues me.
I think we circulated the recent report from, Marty might have to help me, Infrastructure New Zealand, that said the stop-starting of major projects added over the last decade $11.8 billion to the cost of those. The New Zealand, $11.8 billion over the last 10 years due to stop-starting of infrastructure projects in New Zealand. That is $11.8 billion out of our ratepayers and taxpayers' pockets, right? That is not hypothetical money. If you haven't read it, I thought it was really insightful. I also, as part of my onboarding, read quite a few papers on the difference in cost estimating and cost outcomes. There's international studies on the stop-starting and the effects of having an almost democratically designed outcome that is expensive, if I put it mildly.
Yeah. Councillor Baker.
Morena koutou. Thank you, guys. I'm personally learning heaps, so just trying to simplify in my head the complexity. If, say, for example, transport just had a funding spend envelope, we could then know, I think I'm asking what the Mayor may be asking or not, but we would then be able to know what the contingency would be for that envelope, and then you'd just have to fit within that?
Yeah, you can always just set an envelope and we'll fit things within it.
Okay.
I think that is the point of the contingency and the early on bit is that if you give us guidance for 10 years from now, we will fit likely a bit less in because of the uncertainty associated with it. And as you refine, for instance, in November, the transport team presented to council on shovel-ready projects. If you have parameters that we can prioritise with, which the LTP has, you can then shuffle things forward. RCE has the delegation to shift things from a year, so if we end up using less contingency, we can bring scope forward to allow more good stuff to happen. That is really hard to plan 10 years out, right? That's really a near term if and when you use your contingency appropriately. Does that actually help?
That is helpful. And my other question on the stop-starting conversation, do we know the cumulative impact for Tauranga in particular?
No, we haven't looked at that in detail. We have had some conversations about this past year, mainly because for the annual report we have to look at capitalized salaries. When you do a project, your staff write to a capital project. If that capital project is on hold or not progressing, it goes to OPEX and hits your rates. There are some numbers there that tell us signs of the size of it, but we haven't done any thorough analysis on that. I'm going to stop there.
Yeah. No, that's cool. Thank you. So we can get that information if it was asked.
I don't know if we can get that information easily.
Okay.
So if you think about a 10-year period, we've had commissions, we've had massive changes of direction. There's projects that we've stopped and written off. There's projects that we've stopped that are still going in the background because we're redesigning them. It'd be quite an exercise to go through that for TCC specifically. We might be able to do some approximations where we go, well, actually, we had so many projects that stopped out of the total, or something along those lines, to give you an idea of the problem. I think it wouldn't be value for money for staff to actually repeat that exercise fully. Any opinions, Marty? Are you?
No, yeah.
No, yeah, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so Mahe, I had a conversation with Susan earlier today, and as part of us reporting back on end-of-year results, I think there will be questions and some answers, but it's our capital spend for the previous financial year, the one which is just finished, is obviously under that which we'd budgeted, and there are some reasons for that. There are multiple reasons, and I think there'll be a process of us going through and reviewing how we've done, what we have and haven't done, and the reasons for that. So,
Councillor Crowther.
Yeah, thank you. I've got 2 or 3 questions and a quick comment. The comment is I'm glad that it's us doing the waters in our street at the moment, but I do think I'm interested in whether there's a shift on the 30th of June in terms of traffic management processes. I heard the Minister talking about that yesterday, and I think having seen what was on my street, that would be helpful. First, no, that was a comment.
I'm glad we're delivering good water infrastructure for you, Councillor Crowther.
Yeah, thank you. The first question is, Mike, can you send that slide that we didn't get in the pack, that all your hard work, because we couldn't really read it very easily.
No.
Second question is, does everything, in the same way that we heard earlier, we align across smart growth, etc., presumably do we align with external agencies in terms like NZTA in terms of the calculations of contingency and risk, and we use the same methodology, do we?
We have since checked our approach with both Auckland Transport and NZTA. Do you want to comment further, Mike?
Yeah, and on step 5 up there, it does mention the agency's requirements. So we do have to comply with their version of it. So there are times where we fold into the more stringent process. But that usually only applies on quite large projects. So you'll see the big projects rolling through, and they'll have to develop that information as well. But yeah, they do have an influence on the way that we calculate that, and then have to budget for it.
Okay. Well, then my last question is, given that, and looking at those slides where we see the transition from the concept through to the developed design, and then we have the next slide, which talks about program business cases and onwards. Where does I understood the P50 and the P95 methodology both fit within that row of stage 1, initiate, because that's where those two, like the detailed business case is there as well. But it doesn't make sense to me, because the P50 and the indicative business case is, as I understand it, contingency, but once you get to P95 and the detailed business case, you go through a whole process, and then you tease out the risk, and you look at financial risk, and you look at, and basically the contingency is reduced, but when you look at those project costs, P95s are often exceeded, firstly, but secondly, you end up with with much higher numbers for P95s always. So how do you then, okay.
Something we prepared earlier. This wasn't in your pack though. Excuse me. This is as much an art form as it is a science at times, and it all depends on how you understand understand your risks and your scope as you go through the different phases. So the left being development phases to implementation. And the accuracy of a tool. So P50 is a tool. P95 is a tool for understanding what the cost implications are of the risk assessment you've made. And what it does is it assists us to be more accurate in the way that we can forecast what we might spend, but also understands what the risk that we have to manage to bring it down towards that expected estimate. So these are effectively bearings on the future around where you might land with cost. So what you do is, if you're doing P95s very early on, so it's a lot of extra work, it's a lot of extra analysis, and for not a heck of a lot of gain necessarily. But at the same time, P50s, if you don't convert over to P95s at some point through the process, then you'll end up underestimating. So there's risks assessments that happen. So those triangles describe that relationship. So it's a series of relationships between each one. What we're proposing is from our perspective, it's the risks in our projects we're talking. Contingency is just a reflection of risk. And so for simple stuff, smaller stuff, you don't need to do a probabilistic estimate of what the contingency is. You should just use a standard approach, like earlier on, 1% of your total budget should be planning phase or your business case phase, 10% should be design, and blah, 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 so on like that. So we only deploy this when we have to. But in reverse, the big projects absolutely need to do this, and they iterate this. Like you saw earlier on a financial presentation around the constant checking against hedging around financial rates. It's the same idea with here, is we're constantly checking that price against the risk, against the scope, against the market, and so we have to iterate that to the future. So how does that help the LTP? What we don't want to do is have too much contingency in the out years. And if we took a very strict contingency approach and probabilistic on all projects, we'd have too much contingency in the program. Yeah. And so our offering, which is to do P70, we actually can work out that we're going to reduce the amount of contingency sitting in the out years of the program as a result. So you strap that to a good governance process, and then you strap that to good project management, and then you can iterate that and just keep narrowing that band of uncertainty as you go through. But right at the start, you're always going to have a lot more uncertainty.
There's a bit of a summary slide at the end of the improvements we're making relative to previous years. Yes. I also want to note that not everyone might be familiar with the P methodology. P95 is a 95% chance of sticking below or at that cost estimate, and P50 means a 50-50 chance. That implies science that the vast bulk of our projects don't go through. Doing a good probabilistic estimate requires you to run multiple scenarios and uncertainties and Monte Carlos on various aspects of a cost estimate. That is warranted if you're doing a Te Manawa Take o Te Papa project. That is not warranted if you're, Mike, putting in a footpath somewhere. Nice try. The bulk of our projects will simply use a percentage. Now, we might call it P70, P95, or P50 because that is common methodology or common language. What we're really trying to say is we're not trying to cover the highest ever cost. We're trying to cover something in the middle that we think is good enough to cover the outer years especially. And I do note that there's a quite variety of experience in the room. So if anybody wants an offline project management and cost estimating 101, feel free to reach out.
This is 20 slides of a 200 slide deck. Careful what you ask for.
I'm just going to go back to where we were. Were there any... Oh, sorry, Mayor.
No, sorry.
Okay.
Keep going.
So this was all about the cost estimating and how we allow for risk and contingency in that at a high level. we're now going to go into the procurement. So once you have a project, how do you buy the stuff you need for it? And for that, I'll hand over to my friendly colleagues.
Thanks, Renika. I'd like to introduce Andy Kahn. This is Andy's first time in Chambers. Let's go. Let's go. Just don't hold back, everybody. So Andy's our strategic procurement manager, and he's going to take us through just the first slide. Procurement isn't bureaucracy for its own sake. It's the mechanism that protects public money. It ensures decisions remain fair and transparent. The challenge is the balance between transparency, competition, and assurance. Public spending expects all of those things, but we need to create the flexibility to encourage innovation and broaden market participation. So it's about protecting public trust through the Auditor General, the public and media. It's about following process to reduce legal and commercial risk. But value for money does require discipline, which is where procurement can be effective. Departing from it can require strong justification, but in the end, from a governance perspective, consistency does deliver a lot of those risks in terms of mitigation.
Yeah, so it does need to stand up to scrutiny, and that's why there are specific rules and guidelines. So I don't know how much you all do know and don't know, and I'm still in a bit of a learning curve myself, as being fairly new to New Zealand local government. But there is these government procurement rules, and there are NZTA rules. Those apply to central agencies and to NZTA projects, but not to local government. They're more guidelines for local government. So TCC, we align with those, but we look to try and change the approach when it's a benefit to the council. And that's where the opportunity is for us, and that's where I'm looking now from a different lens, trying to apply a more commercial commercial lens and a more enabling lens to what we're trying to do here, and seeing where we can do that, where we can apply that. And for me, that's getting in as early as we can at that scoping stage. It's been talked about a lot before, so that we can work with the project managers to make sure we're getting the right procurement, to really make sure we're getting value for money, and what's the appropriate phase to do it, and whether it can be done differently. Just because we've always done it the same way here doesn't make it right. So you can see the process as you look at the requirement first. For NZTA, they're the 51% funding partner, so that's why they dictate what the rules are. And then we need to look at, a bit like we've been talking about before for projects, how complex is the project, what are the methods, what insurances do we need to have, and then we can plan the procurement process. So at TCC, we have specific thresholds for direct appointment or non-direct appointment. So that table in the bottom left is really for telling you when do we, as staff, need an exemption if we're going to try and do a direct appointment. And you can see the first one is up to 100,000. You can direct appoint on quotes and just in information. Then up to 250,000, it starts to be the one-up process. So you've got you can direct appoint or use a closed solution up to 250,000, but you have to have the one-up approval from your line manager, and that can just be an email. And that's to not slow processes down when we need to trust that staff know what they're doing and they're making those good decisions. As soon as you go above that 250,000 here, it then needs to have an exemption if you're going to do a direct or closed solution. And those exemptions are they're quite a robust forms that I've looked at here for us to go through. And for 250 to 500, the general manager needs to sign off that exemption. For 500 to 3 million, the chief executive needs to sign it off. And for anything above 3 million, it needs to come to yourselves with a full paper. I don't know how much you know about sort of direct appointments, so I'll let you ask questions about whether you want to know about direct appointments and the use of panels. But if there are any questions around that.
Yeah, cool. Thank you, and welcome to Chambers. Where's your favourite place to eat in Tauranga, first of all?
Picnicker probably so far.
Nice. Safe choice.
Is it a Tuesday night when they do the meat one? Barbecue night, yeah.
Nice. Thank you. Question, do we know, so the threshold thing's quite interesting to me. Can we percentage-ise, that's so not a word, how many projects across a business within the organisation is sorry, I'm framing this really poorly. So for transport, do we know how many projects are at each threshold across their whole portfolio of work? We do. That's cool. And the other one is at what kind of threshold are we really pushing the boat out on local procurement and providing new, particularly local providers with opportunities to get in on some of our business?
So on the second question, there's no distinction at the level. If it's a direct appointment, local could be in trouble. It's a really interesting one though. So whenever we run a tender, we always say we encourage local, all tenders, and the default is open. Even for NZTA, go open. What local means is interesting, because if you get an outside firm who's not local and they say, I would like to come to town, all of a sudden local's definition changes. All of a sudden you've got a new company that's entered the market, which can create competition. If you define local strictly though, you must already be here. And so the traditional definition is every time we look for it, we encourage it, but sometimes over time we start to question, well, what's the right outcome for being local?
Sorry, just to add to that, the agency's new procurement process doesn't define local, it defines small to mediums. So what they're trying to do is encourage people into the supply chain to increase the competitiveness of the supply chain. So they're very clear about their outcome, which is competitiveness. So they've structured it so that a certain percentage of work must go to small to mediums directly, which is, one, they don't get clipped the ticket on the way through if they're working for a tier one, and two, it means that that you're encouraging people to come and challenge those tier ones, and, knock them off their pedestal, if you like, with their own companies. So they've moved away over the years from a pure local kind of definition.
I do want to add something to that. If you engage a small local company, especially if they're innovative and they're trying to do something a little different, that requires a lot more contract management. So they may not have fully secure HSE systems. They may not know how to do, say, something like temporary traffic management, and need more hand-holding through a process. That is done by staff. Staff are the contract managers in that case. The amount of smaller companies we engage with is directly relational to the amount of contract management we can actually do within the resourcing we have, if that makes sense. Innovation on top of that requires extra focus. We have at times done more innovative companies, so small innovative, say scale-up type companies through tier ones. That is a conflict, right? If you have an established business and you allow innovation to happen underneath them, you're not setting people up for success. We don't have targets for local, like we don't have targets for Māori-led businesses or for innovation businesses. They would require different approaches each. There are informal things we do on top of the procurement framework, like we don't engage innovative companies under tier ones anymore. That's not appropriate. There could be a wider conversation held about desire of engagement with certain market segments relative to resourcing, relative to outcomes we're looking for. Then I'm going to just leave there because we probably don't have time for it today, but I just wanted to flag it.
Councillor Morris.
Thank you. Good morning. I'd be interested in what the scale is down at that lower level of 1 to 100K, and I just say that because I down the road asked for some engineering advice and had to submit an expenditure request to my
Right.
manager, and it was certainly,
So, yeah.
certainly well within the that first band.
I can see Andy taking an action to get it back to elected members. What I can tell you, it's about 95.5. So 95% of the transactions are are down, and 5% are above. So I think I'd say it's probably above 250. Really low transaction counts at the bottom end. In actual fact, the churn in the business is at the bottom end. Yeah. So you really encourage, don't spend too long on it, because you spend more time actually processing the thing than you actually do. But I don't know if it was the same at your business. Yeah. But Andy will get you the correct data. Oh, is it?
50 cents.
Okay.
Can't even buy a Mars bar. Right.
Can I add something to that as well that might be interesting or useful to know, is that when we tendering for panels and companies that we use, there's always a 10% included in the criteria. 10% of it always has to be for that economic benefit or that broader outcomes that you might know is an entrenched thing here, which is really good. So that's always really important. And also that covers off the sort of economic, the social, the environmental and the cultural side of things. But also when they do these panels, when we tender for these panels, it's making sure we've got the appropriate level for the supply that we're going out for, by which I mean you've got the big high-tier companies that you talked about, but also the smaller ones. You want the big ones, so you've got that resources that are there and that reliability and consistency that's there. But when you want a quick reaction, you also want the smaller companies as well, those smaller local ones. So that's where you can bring them both in. It's not just who's the biggest and best at this. It's, okay, who's the big reliable one? We can do the big chunk of work, but how can we get the smaller guys in as well? They might not have the insurance cover, they might not have the resource for everything, but let's try and get them involved so they can do the local reactionary stuff. So that's how we try and get the locals in as well.
Can I just clarify one point that was raised? In the policy, there is actually a target for Māori and Pacifica businesses and work to support social enterprises. It was set by Council Resolution in October 2023, and it's a target of at least 5% of the value of all influenceable spend to be awarded to those businesses. So
My apologies and thank you, CJ.
Can I just add, so are we measuring that? And do we know, are we meeting that target?
We'll get an update on that and bring it back.
So I think that aligns with the government's required, because when I was in a government role, there was a 5% target as well. And it sounds like we might have adopted that, but it'll be really useful to see how, it's interesting with the target, it's obviously a goal, not a fixed.
That's right, yeah. I think measuring the target as proportion of spend is important, as opposed to the proportion of suppliers.
Yeah.
So if you can find one or two high-performing Māori businesses, that proportion of spend can push in very quickly to achieve the target, as opposed to a large number of startups. How do you want to go after that? I think I remember there was a discussion with the Māori Business Association about this too a few years ago. But we'll take the action and bring it back.
Yeah, because there's a big organisation called Amotai, I think, that's what they specialise in.
Yeah, we work with them.
Yeah, cool.
So just on the panels, just listening to that conversation, is there anything stopping us from having 100 panel members? Because all it really is we've pre-vetted them, because this is one of the big things that I hear all the time around, small businesses. We just don't, we've given up on doing work for council because it's too hard. So is there a way we can pre-vet all these companies so that it's an easy process that they can do work for us?
I'm just going to talk about the practicalities of that for a second, and then I'll hand to Alistair. We do have smaller companies on panels. So if you're doing waters, engineering and construction work, the panel looks very different from if you're doing spaces and places, say park benches and playgrounds. And we do specifically allow for some of that smaller end of town in where it's appropriate. In terms of having 100 panel members, you could. It'd be a massive effort, but you could. The impact of that, though, is that what we do with the panel is we select the handful of companies that align, and then we tender through those. So you have a panel, you have a piece of work, you send it to your panel. If you have 100 companies that you're then effectively tendering into, for every piece of work, you're asking 99 of them to do work for nothing. And that is a either disrespectful way of working with them. It's definitely debilitating for the smaller end of town to have to do multiple of these before they get awarded a job. Having a smaller provider on a panel gives them more certainty than not, and provides them going through such a process once. Now, there are other conversations you can have about direct engagements of some of these smaller companies, etc., but the practicality of those panels is that the bigger you make them, the less engaged they become.
The answer is no.
So, Deputy Mayor, yeah.
Oh, sorry. There's no constraint to doing that.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Deputy Mayor.
Thank you. So just in terms of the process, and are we going to talk about the criteria that are examined next, or is this part of the slide?
Part of this slide.
Okay, so when it comes to council, if it's a $30 million project, do we just have one, we approve it and it's therefore procured, or does the 3 million mean that the different parts of that project and the procurement of those different parts are separately transparent to us?
The 3 million guidance is for sole sourcing. So you want to bypass a whole tender process and you want to go straight to one provider. That's when the 3 million comes to council. Other spend has different DFAs, and our delegations authority is 347 pages big, so I can't quickly summarize that for you. But generally, if it is within spend, within budgeted spend, it doesn't need to go through council right up to give or take 10 million. Have I got that broadly correct?
I'm probably not so much on what the delegations, the level are. I'm just trying to think. So can we just go back to a recent time that council was asked to go through this procurement process, and obviously not right now, but because I'm still not quite clear on how the criteria, how we are, if I look at the slide on the part of it, it's not to me quite clear what the critical factors that we would be considering, and therefore would make our decision to say yay or nay, or this, or tender, or supplier A or supplier B. That's not as clear as I would like it, and I just think the criteria under which the procurement happens, if we can actually have the last couple of times that we as council were involved in this process, then we could actually compare that with the slide. Would that be possible, please?
Yeah, thank you for that. You're right. This doesn't actually give you the, let's say, the decision tree on how you go from woe to go on procurement and what your options are. I'll highlight the procurement plan. So when the project has an idea of what they want to do, a procurement plan is written. That generally comes to GMs for sign-off. That dictates things like we'll go to a limited tender, or we go to an EOI process, and then or we do direct appointment for this one. Those things are considered in that space. But for the wider, can we provide some training? I'll pass it back to Alistair.
I'd like to just, Councillor Schuyler, just confirm I understand the question. When decisions are brought to council relating to future procurement, being really clear on the criteria by which different tenders are compared, is that the task you'd like us to do?
I'd like to see when was the last time that we hit the 3 million? Is it, and I'd just like to review that paper and understand where those criteria, as Renika's acknowledged weren't on here, where those criteria were set out, and I'd just like to have 2 of those, and possibly even one that the Chief Executive approved, just so that I'm clear on that there's real clarity and transparency on what the factors are, what the criteria are to make the decision.
Yeah, so
what's the decision tree? What are the things that have been considered until now? And that, because this is not suggesting we're making a change. So I'm not talking about what will happen in the future. I'd like to see a couple of those papers when the 3 million was reached, and just to understand what criteria we were asked to make the decision against.
through your worship, yes. So the 3 million threshold is around direct appointment. So what we can do is bring back some examples where we've come to council to seek endorsement of that direct appointment process. I think a good example of council being involved in decision making around procurement options would be Tarrats and 15th, and I think if we wind the clock back, I think to the early term of this council, paper was brought to you about a procurement methodology on Tarrats and 15th, and generally for those large projects we would seek guidance, and generally, in fact, almost always would seek guidance from council, particularly on those major scale projects, on methodology.
Isn't Tarrat one that's the 51% is NZTA and therefore they decide?
No, they're just a partner. So there was a specific paper that came to council.
Yeah, I remember it. Yeah. I was actually thinking of sort of non-roading projects because they tend to have more complexity, where I can just be clear on what the criteria are.
Just to be clear, the criteria is around tendering, which would not come to council.
So under what decision tree are, when staff make a recommendation that this is the things that council need to decide, what's the decision tree? What are the criteria? Are they the things that are lowest price, quality, method, capability, capacity, relevant experience, or do we only get one choice because we decide we're going to go with single?
So all of this is set out in the procurement policy.
I'm just trying to think, are we actually making the decision on who we're procuring from, and if we are, what are the criteria
we're not making that in most situations.
No, but over 3 million we are.
No, we're not. That's a direct appointment. If we decide to directly appoint someone, it has to come to council for us to appoint them.
In that
So
case,
we're
we
not
haven't
making any
tendered.
decisions on procurement.
No, in that case, we haven't tendered, so the criteria don't apply. These are usually bespoke, where there is a specific situation where we're not going to tender and engage the wider market, but we're going to go straight to one party. There will be a paper from a waters perspective coming to council on that in the next month or so. That will give you one example. But we can circulate a historic transport example to give you insights into that one as well. The 3 million, again, direct appointment only, bypassing all the systems. The normal systems, like CJ highlighted, are part of the procurement policy. And I think it's good if we take an action to make sure that we circulate that so you can review it and see if there's anything that you want to raise with regards to that policy. Does that help?
Yeah, but this really says to me this is delegated authority, but it doesn't say what are the criteria against which we make purchases as a team of three.
That's in 3: lowest price confirming, price, quality, method, capabilities, capacities, relevant experience, and methodology. So that's the criteria.
And it would be good to have a couple of examples of how that has been assessed. Because that raises that whole thing of capability. Have we actually looked at innovative new solutions or things that we've just done before? People we've just used before.
So I think
I'll take this offline.
Yeah, I think it's detail we can talk about.
I am conscious of time.
Yeah, we'll keep moving.
We have another procurement slide and then a summary slide on the cost estimating to go through that details improvements.
Yeah.
Are we good to go to the next slide? Well, we are, but my slide pack isn't. There we go.
Local government culture and procurement processes, they coexist, but with some tension. Procurement isn't the purpose. Procurement's a process we go after. Local government has its own purpose, and that's the community outcomes. It's the mindset that sits between those two that's the task of senior leaders and commercial folk to try and get the best outcomes for the community and the best value for money, and along the way embed that culture. Bottom left-hand corner points to the strategies that, you know, no matter how we do it, whether it's a public-private partnership, we're looking at debt, we're looking at service arrangements or term, the objectives always end up hopefully at the same place, which is the best value, which is not always the lowest. It's about supporting competitive markets, but with fair supplier access. And Andy's team goes into the community once a quarter, meets with local businesses who want to know, how do I engage with council? How can I sell my services? Because sometimes it's really hard to know who to reach out to. And then align with the longer term plans that we're discussing here and demonstrate public value. And there's some examples there as well. And that's the procurement section.
Yeah, I guess I definitely get that, community outcomes, but we've got to be better. So like if you're a commercial person, you always look at the feasibility, you know, does the cost, can you get a return on the cost effectively? That's, if you look at it from a very simple, and at some point feasibility doesn't work and you don't do it. And I think that's probably the thing that we need. And I know it's different in council because it's not that easy, because you can't say we get this much financial, you know, building the Papamoa shared pathway, we can't say, well, we get a financial return of this amount. But it is important that we go, does the community outcome, is that enough of a return? You know, the 5 people using that a year, does that justify the $1 million? Or do we need, you know, what is our, and I think that's a really key thing is we need to not monetize, but we need to understand the community outcomes, and we need a balancing point, what makes sense and what doesn't. You know, what gives us a community return, what doesn't. And I think that is something that we can be better at.
I can see a number of people itching to comment on this. Treasury's better business case language, it shifted the maturity, not just in Wellington, but in local government, about monetising benefit. Transport outcomes often relate to how much more safer are people and how easy is it for people to get to work, and monetising and placing a value on those in order to justify which roads to do. Business case writing and putting a value on community outcomes is a work in progress here. It isn't happening every time we do it. The financial side is the exam. It's like a pass mark, but working out actually, do we have the economic and the demographic data? The bigger the project, the more likely it is you'll see it. I think that's to Renika's point. But those community ones, I think that's our opportunity to get better.
It's also across the portfolio really hard to define that value comparatively, right? How do you compare minutes saved or seconds saved in transit time on a transport project relative to access to your local park with a playground? They're really hard to compare, which is where the business case methodology can fall over a bit as well.
Yeah, I get that, but it also sort of talks about scope, and it also talks about actually what you're prepared to pay. You know, because you know the steps down there that you know 10 people a day use, you know, you'd be prepared to pay less than the ones over there that 100 people use. You know, it's trying to actually, you know, actually do a little bit more work around understanding that and,
Yeah.
you know, what's important to people. Like, you know, like if you said, oh, well, I'm going to save you 5 minutes every day that you go to work, or you can have a community playground, be interesting to know, you know, what people would choose. But, you know, that's where those priorities, et cetera,
Yeah,
come in. So.
and interesting to see how many people you'd annoy with one choice or the other. There's more conversation to be had on this.
Yeah.
In the interest of time,
Yeah, we'll get
are we
moving.
happy with
Yeah.
the value for money slide we've just seen? Yeah, okay, then just a quick summary of improvements. So we've gone over the methodology. Now, the methodology is in place, but we found areas where it wasn't working for the outcomes we want. For instance, project cost estimating contingencies were a bit inconsistent, which leads to observations like, for a certain batch of projects, it seems like we're always exceeding our P95, the historical issues. So key improvements in this development is then that we're shifting to a consistent application of contingency, the one bottom bullet there, across all projects and programs. That doesn't mean that the outcome will always be the same. The workshop approach for an ultra-large project will always yield a different risk and contingency number that is required for that specific project than the bulk that just uses a percentage. We're aligning with best practice, and we've talked about NZTA, and we've shown an example from Auckland Transport as well. We are shifting to a P70 instead of a P95. And again, I'll reiterate, that implies more science than there actually is. There's no large-scale Monte Carloing that our staff are doing on this, right? But what we're trying to do is move away from the highest possible cost estimates to something that will likely meet, but gives us room to move and put more projects in for the value of our community. And finally, we've introduced the stage gate approach. I know we're not going to get a chance to talk through the actual project management style and governance key elements of this. The key takeaway is that we have a fit-for-purpose project management process that early on defines that lower complexity, lower cost, lower risk projects use a very fit-for-purpose approach. We've seen that in the signs-off on the procurement stage. We've seen it in the stage gates, who makes decisions on things. We are aligning with best practice. We have also made it really clear, I hope, in this presentation, that the early project phases are the best place to influence. Both scope and contingency will allow for more input at that stage. You leave a legacy in future years or decades rather than necessarily in this calendar year. And we have more improvements to do, but we think we're taking a meaningful step in this LTP. Close off there. Any further questions?
Councillor Crowther.
Two quick questions. One, did we use, you seem to imply we might have used P95 last LTP? Is
yes.
That's interesting. Okay. Second thing is the P70, because I think you were saying there's a lack of, you know, like time spent trying to go through all the complexities of getting reference case analysis and all that sort of stuff. So is P70 your attempt to kind of counter the inbuilt optimum bias that's been found? So when you look at P50s, internationally P50s don't deliver 50% of the time. No. And in New Zealand, that's even more so for things like highway projects, roading projects, rail, etc. So is the P70 kind of saying we'd normally like to do P50 overall, but we know P50 is not really a P50. So we think a P70 is a P50? Is that kind of decoding what you're doing?
Not quite. Again, it's an expression of risk. So it's the amount of time and work that you put into quantifying and monetizing that risk that you see in a project. In an earlier slide, we had sort of that base cost estimate and then risk assessment and then contingency assessment. And what we're trying to say to you is that across the program, your lighter weight projects will have a less complicated view of that risk, and then therefore will impact the longer term program less. As you go up the graduated system, we think once you get into stuff that becomes risky, medium, large and extra large type projects, P70 is going to suffice with understanding how much contingency and risk that we're prepared to push into the outer part of the program. And that will enable council to meet its LTP requirements and legislative requirements on that element, and also not over-egg the OBMIT. Everything inside the 3 years, though, when we get as we get closer to implementation and design and construction, you can be much more assured that there's a lot more work and understanding in those projects in those phases. This approach here really is about our early phase stuff, where you could put a lot of contingency in the out years and in a not a very professional way. So we're suggesting to do less assessment, therefore allow for that in future years.
I'm also going to call Jane into the conversation. There was some eyebrow language going on that I didn't quite get.
I was just going to make the distinction, Councillor Crowther, that this is for the purposes of the LTP in terms of calculating risk and contingency for projects as they move to implementation. Then a full, on the larger projects, a full risk assessment and or contingency amount is allocated. So the purpose of the discussion today is how are we in the outer years, if you like, calculating the cost, if you like, or the line item that would go into the LTP for these projects.
Yeah, thank you, absolutely. I guess my concern is that doing my own reference case analysis, I think, I mean, it's, and someone in our community has done quite a bit of work on this, that consistently across the LTPs, the curve is always that you, for the set projects, you underestimate the costs. So therefore, when you get to a 10-year plan, if you're using P95s in the past and you're consistently under-egging it, then if you consciously reduce to P70, meaning that those P50s are normally a lower number than a P95, so P70 in the middle, I'm just trying to understand that aspect.
So when you do your annual plan, you would be reassessing. So this is, yeah, so you're getting a more accurate cost as you move through the post.
Yep,
this,
no, totally get it. Yep.
Yeah. So
but that's not my concern. Like, yes, but what I worry about is that we have unrealistic expectations because we sort of say, well, I mean, just one example, and I'm not, you can give the opposite example too, but as, oh, let's just crank up the spending this couple of years because we'll just get these across the line, these important projects, and then we'll lower the CapEx forecast in the LTP because, you know, that it'll all work out fine, except that it never does. It's always the exact opposite, and the debt increases, which puts more downward pressure on us to say, let's reduce the CapEx in the future. So we start off with unrealistic expectations, and this seems likely to worsen that at precisely the time that we're getting a rates cap and a tighter debt constraint.
Comment on that as a counterbalance view to that. We've had papers come to council and conversations about Te Tumu, and that the cost of infrastructure there will actually stop that development if we're not careful. That is largely driven by P95 cost estimating. The costs in there can be less as we refine scope and risk. The more we know, the more we can get. Had we put in P70 cost estimates, the total infrastructure cost for Te Tumu could have taken out well over 100 million, and that doesn't change anything. All that does is change the contingency that you allow for. In that case, you've actually, had we done this at P70 instead of P95, we would have realistically been able to plan for more scope. Now, I hear you that the historical cost estimating hasn't always sat on that end of the spectrum. But we have to be careful to try and stay in the middle of it and not on either extreme of way too high or way too low a cost estimating cycle.
I guess my response is that, through the chair, is that I don't think we have been way too low, and I think there's evidence quite clearly to show that. And I just came from a meeting this morning where a group of people are looking at the whole, what the mayor and deputy mayor raised at our last meeting, which is the cost of greenfield infrastructure, which typically in Tauranga has overrun from all the evidence that I've seen, and I'm happy for Christine to comment if she wants, and the costs of intensification, which have typically not been very transparent, so we can't compare them. And I think we're in danger of pushing ahead greenfield. That's precisely my concern, is that we'll push ahead something like Te Tumu and say it'll all be okay on the day, because we're reducing those estimates to squeeze it into a plan that can't sustain that amount of expending.
No, there's actually been some great work going on Te Tumu specifically within council on sense checking the totality of that cost estimate. That did exactly that. It removed, or it gave us the opportunity to remove significant costs for scope, and it took into account recent projects, so reference cases, if you like. The P70, we feel, is the best way, although it's not truly a P70, but the idea of aiming not for a highest possible cost estimate to cover all potential and not a P50 that we will likely not deliver, the P70 marker allows us to meet most of our requirements. There will always be an outlier project that hits a P200 or a P0, but the program at P70 should allow for the vast majority of projects to continue. And then, of course, the world will change. We might have COVID 2.0, we might have another Iran war, who knows? But from what we know now, this is what we think is the most balanced approach to the issues we currently face.
Then my suggestion would be, please share all that good work, because I'd rather than a faith-based approach, which I take sometimes here, but I would much rather see an evidence-based approach, because we've seen evidence to the contrary, and there's been work done in our community on it and by consultancy here, and I think it'd be really good to actually see what's counteracting that.
So as we've been doing, all the greenfield feasibility development work will come to you. We just haven't brought Te Tumu because there are still questions around the costs of acquiring access corridors, and further work happening in terms of the wastewater solutions that you have passed resolutions on. So we've done a lot of the work, but it's not complete until those two elements, so wastewater solutions and the land access costs are addressed, and then it will come to you as a full feasibility analysis.
Okay,
Yep.
but please
Christine,
share
can
anything
you
you've
use the
got.
microphone, please?
I'll try to summarise what CJ was saying, in that the full feasibility of Te Tumu will come from her group to full council. It is awaiting work to be done on access, so corridor cost, and the wastewater, which will come to you in the next meeting or so to full council. Did I summarise that?
That's correct, and we always bring feasibility work to you, because even though growth pays for growth and we're trying to push as much onto the developers, some of it is sitting at debt. So we want to provide you with information that you can form a view as to whether or not the risk that the community takes on and taking that debt is likely to be able to be recovered, not that the developer can't make money out of it and doesn't proceed and council gets left with the debt. So it's a key part of your decision-making process. It's just not complete at this point. We'll bring it when we've done all the work.
All right, we better. Is there any more from you? Okay, thank you very much. We'll wrap that up, and I'll pass back to Councillor Baker to close this off. Thank you.
Hang on 1 second. There was a small section. This was it for me. There was a small section from the finance team. Can we quickly align whether that can just be taken as read, or?
It was just covering off the zero-based budgeting approach, confirming that we will be adopting that process, and we can just confirm that again in the council paper. If there were any questions, though, if there's anything you'd like to ask. And I think there's also some non-financial performance.
Yep, there are a few slides in the pack on non-financial performance. I think if you read those through, unless there's any, we don't think there's any sort of key issues that would be concerning, we can bring that directly back to a council meeting, but we did just want to bring it here for an opportunity. So if you're comfortable with all of that, we'll continue to move forward and bring those back for formal decisions at council.
Thank you. So, hand back to Councillor Baker. Yeah, would. It'd be good to organise a.
Do it offline, if you like.
Yeah, that'd be good. Yeah. All right, Councillor Baker.
Ka whakaeria te tapu kia wātea te ara ki mui a tātou kia tūru ki whakataha ai, kia tūru ki whakataha ai haumi e hui.